Welcome to Real Talk China. My name is Cyrus Janssen, and I will be your host on this brand new series that is debuting exclusively here on YouTube. Real Talk China is dedicated to bringing real insights, unique stories, and deep analysis on China from experts on the ground and around the world. Our debut episode takes us to Asia's world city, Hong Kong, to discuss some of the recent controversial events that have rocked the city. While Western media has been quick to praise the efforts of student leaders like Joshua Wong, their inability to condemn acts of violence against common citizens has questioned the entire legitimacy of their political campaigns.
You can't even look me in the face and say, I condemn this kind of inhuman treatment.
We would not do any kinds of public condemns.
In today's episode, I bring in two university students who provide a different and healthy perspective on the situation. From the controversial extradition bill to Hong Kong's new national security law, we will discuss everything you need to know about Hong Kong. All right, so I'm very happy to welcome in the studio the Keybros. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here today. Now, I'd like to start off today's topic just to know a little bit more about your background and what really motivated the two of you to come together and start a YouTube channel.
So yeah, we're basically final year law students in London in the UK.
Okay.
And I think the main reason is we just think there needs to be a civil and rational voice in Hong Kong, which has pretty much been missing. The city being really polarized, like with one side, people who are staunchly, separatist, very extreme, very radical. On the other side, also got people who really want to integrate with the mainland. So there's no sort of middle ground, like a civil rational voice. There's like a vacuum here in Hong Kong.
We felt like amongst our younger generation, there is some sort of echo chamber going on. We really had to provide a platform for those who disagree with kind of the so-called mainstream opinion to voice out their own opinions as well. Because we actually received lots of private messages from people who actually agreed with us, but were too afraid to speak out because they felt they were alone in the fight. So I think it's really positive for us to kind of provide a platform for those people as well.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the first things that I noticed when I first saw, some of your earlier videos. It was really a refreshing thing for me as a content creator myself here on YouTube, someone that is speaking out and has sometimes a different opinion than what mainstream media might report. I'd like to start there today and really start discussing this controversial extradition bill, because I know there probably is some of the audience that are Western members that don't really know the full story behind this. There was a Hong Kong man that went with his pregnant girlfriend to Taiwan. They went on Valentine's Day. He actually murdered his pregnant girlfriend in Taiwan, boarded the plane, went back to Hong Kong. But because there is not extradition arrangements between the city of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, mainland China, he was not able to be sent back to Taiwan to stand trial for his crime there. And this really was what prompted everything to say, well, you know what? Here we are in Hong Kong. We should have an extradition bill. What is your opinion on this extradition bill? Is this a legitimate bill that Hong Kong should actually have? Or do you feel that it is Beijing simply overstepping their boundaries, trying to put more direct force into the city?
Well, I think one thing we can all observe from the anti-extradition bill movement is this sort of fear-mongering and misinformation that was going on during the protests, which actually highlights how irrational civil discourse has become in Hong Kong. Because I feel like most people, when they go out to protest, they come to their opinions or come to their conclusions without actually reading the bill or getting firsthand information. So they rely on media outlets which may not be impartial, such as Apple Daily or Stan News. So they simply cherry pick several provisions or even make up legally inaccurate opinions and then feed it to the public, and they all believe it. But actually, if you read the extradition bill itself, there are several safeguards which prevent the Hong Kong government or indeed the mainland government from abusing this arrangement or this proposed arrangement. So, for example, the extradition bill will only be applicable to violent crimes. I think there are like 20-something of them, which are clearly stipulated, specified in the bill. So, and for one, the extradition bill definitely doesn't apply to political prisoners. So the idea that the mainland can simply abuse this bill and just kind of like suppress freedom of speech, suppress freedom of assembly in Hong Kong is simply legally inaccurate. The instant that we saw literally millions of people come out to protest, it kind of like encouraged us to have a think and be like, well, are these people's opinion justified, or do they really know what they're doing?
To some extent, I'd say we do sympathize with what's like the protest. We don't want to say that it's completely unjustified. Once the movement started to develop and it turned pretty violent, maybe around a month later, in like, remember, July is the turning point. It really started to get us thinking, is the violence really justified? And that's when we decided to go and actually look at the bill itself. And we found it's not actually as bad as what the Western media portrays it to be. So legally, I don't think the bill has much of a big problem. It does address a legal loophole in our system. I think the major problem with the bill is not the content itself, but the timing. All right, the way the Hong Kong government has presented the bill without much consultation for us citizens.
I think the Hong Kong government has always, at least in recent years, exemplified a sort of political insensitivity. So in the sense that when the instant they saw this legal loophole, which, by the way, I think is in existence partially because the central government has more or less refrained from altering Hong Kong's socio-legal system, and that's why we don't have an extradition treaty with the mainland in the first place. The instant the Hong Kong government saw this incident, they're like, oh, we're going to fix this, we're going to pass a bill, and it doesn't really matter what the public opinion or the public reaction or the pushback from the public would be. Yeah, they're pretty indecisive. I think that really stemmed from the civil servant system that we have here. People are trained to just sit in the office, push paperwork. They don't really go out to meet with the public, so they're pretty insensitive. And I think that's not really only the fault of like Hong Kong itself. It's to do with the whole institution that's come from actually the colonial period, which was set up by the British government, that has caused this sort of mindset to appear.
I think you hit on some really good points here. The first point is, is how the media portrayed this. For instance, I read an article that had said, all of the artists in Hong Kong, they're taking down their artwork because it might be deemed politically incorrect, and they could be sent to Beijing and put in jail for the rest of their life. This bill, like you said, it's there's 20 specific crimes that they've laid out. They're very serious crimes. I don't think I don't think Beijing's going to pass a bill to go in and try to lock up all of the artists or anybody that has, does a minor crime or disagrees with the government. I really like what you said there as well, that the Hong Kong government could have done a better job. They said, look, let's actually have a discussion about this bill. Let's actually examine what type of penalties or what kind of crimes would need to be committed for you to be extradited. I think if they would have went through those steps, and actually just had better communication, I think it would have been a lot better for the society. But it's really hard when you look at the case that, again, initiated this. When you have somebody murder another person and then can't be extradited, I mean, that's a huge loophole. And so, but I like both points that we've made here. There's certainly some fear mongering. There's certainly some issues with Western media, or media in general and how they're reporting that. But it also, Hong Kong government could have done a better job as well. This kind of leads us, into these political protests that was, certainly the extradition bill. And that led to a new issue. And that was a grassroots movement for democracy and independence. And this is something that was really trending a lot. Of course, we had the United States, was getting involved in the protest as well. We saw many protesters, holding up American flags, Donald Trump, come and liberate us, give us our independence, our freedom, help us out. One of the things that I don't believe a lot of Westerners really understand about Hong Kong is how diverse the political landscape truly is. For example, in my home country of America, it's very clear we have two parties. You're either a Democrat or you're a Republican. There's really no other choices out there. And I think that many people, think that you are, for independence and you want to separate from Beijing, or you support Beijing. That there's also just two parties in Hong Kong. However, it's actually much more complex and a lot more diverse. So can you tell everybody a little bit more about Hong Kong's political system?
I think it would be more apt to characterize Hong Kong's political environment as being separated into three camps. So the first one would obviously be the pro-government, pro-Beijing, pro-establishment camp. The second one would be pan-Democrats. And the third one would actually be these sort of pro-independence, localist, kind of populist, grassroots-based movements. One interesting incident to observe would be the 2019 district council elections, which was, to this date, the latest election to take place in Hong Kong. 57% of the popular vote went to the pan-Democrat camp.
Okay.
And many outsiders or many Western media outlets like CNN, Fox News, they would report that as a landslide victory for, this this idea that Hong Kong should separate from Beijing, Hong Kong should have its independence, But I think that's actually inaccurate, because if you actually kind of really dig into the data and really look into the different camps, different strands of political opinion at play in Hong Kong, you could actually observe that only 5% of the popular vote within that 57% went to localist or so-called radical groups like Civic Action, People Power. And these groups are actually very much different and very much actually diametrically opposed to the mainstream democratic parties, because the mainstream democratic parties in Hong Kong, at least by name, support one country, two systems. For example, if you look at the manifesto of the fourth largest democratic party in Hong Kong, the ADPL, their slogan is to advocate democracy and strive for a high degree of autonomy under Chinese sovereignty. And we actually have a saying in the Hong Kong political sphere, which is called Dao Wang in Cantonese. Dao Wang means battling the yellows, or battling within the yellows. So obviously the yellow camp refers to the so-called anti-police, or now more like the anti-establishment, anti-Beijing camp. So Dao Wang, battling within the yellows, means the mainstream democratic parties are actually fighting with the localist parties for support. And the localist party are very much against and very much opposed to these mainstream democratic parties, because the localists see them as traitors to the Hong Kong people, simply because of the mere fact that the democratic parties accept Chinese sovereignty and they want to preserve one country, two systems. So the idea that a vote for a pan-democrat entails a vote for independence is simply inaccurate, and is a gross, simplification of the political landscape in Hong Kong.
I think that that's a really key thing that I want people to understand, is the fact that you can certainly be, pro-democrat, but not necessarily be pro-independence. And that is the key thing. And like you said, there is a very small minority that really wants to, separate from mainland, because I think, many people in Hong Kong really truly understand that, Hong Kong's economy, depends on a good relationship with mainland China. You look at the economy, you look at simple thing of like, where does Hong Kong get most of its water from? Where does it get most of the food from? Just logistically, it doesn't make sense, for Hong Kong to separate. But of course, you are going to have, a group of people that still want to, strive for that. But it is a much, much smaller percentage than I think is represented in Western media. What other insights do you have?
Yeah, I think this pretty shows that our landscape is very polarized. The current pandems at the moment, they're driving towards a trend that's actually anti-democratic, because the way they have moved forward in the protests with like all the violence that ensued, I think it really goes against our fundamental democratic values. Because I don't think, for example, burning people on the streets with liquid or throwing bricks at people and killing people, that is actually a democratic move. Democracy entails that we understand and try to listen rationally and peacefully to what the other has to say, and maybe agree to disagree. But we don't really see that in Hong Kong. Some people want direct integration with the mainland. Some people maybe want to keep the current system. Some people actually want more democracy, but under Chinese sovereignty. The main thing here is that being so-called pro-establishment doesn't mean one has to be anti-democracy. And I think that's a lot of the misconception Western world has towards this side of Hong Kong.
The pan-democratic camp in general, their real enemy, or at least whom they perceive to be the real enemy, is kind of in a way not necessarily the central government, but the oligarchs who today, to them, control Hong Kong's economy, control the real estate business, control even the supermarkets, retail stores, convenience stores, and so on. And I think especially to these populist grassroots-based movements, their goal in Hong Kong is to clear out the oligarchs and redistribute wealth amongst Hong Kong people. And it's not necessarily related to civic rights or democratic values or the rule of law or even Beijing. I think in a way, Beijing is not necessarily a very salient issue to them. And the connection they draw between Beijing and the Hong Kong government is simply that, well, the oligarchs are colluding with the mainland and with the Hong Kong government to, I don't know, impose economic tyranny over the Hong Kong people, not necessarily political tyranny. So I think it's, again, a very severe simplification to say that a vote for the pandemics is necessarily a vote for independence.
Those are great points, gentlemen. And I think there's a few things that I just want to add into that. And like you said, a vote for the pandemics does not necessarily mean a vote for independence, just like a vote for pro-establishment does not mean that you're anti-democracy. So I think within, these three camps that you've said, there's multiple branches or multiple viewpoints within all of those. So this really just shows, how unique this situation is in Hong Kong and how incredibly complex it is as well. So you can see that there's certainly going to be some challenges for the government, and certainly under this, one country and two systems that you have. I mean, it is a very complex situation. On June 30th this year, 2020, Beijing passed the controversial national security law for the city of Hong Kong. Now, despite the law being required under Article 23 of the Hong Kong Basic Law, there has certainly been a severe backlash, within the community in Hong Kong, but also the international community. Many countries around the world, has been giving Beijing a lot of pressure, in regards to this national security law. Now, as an American, I understand very much that these national security laws are very common for many countries around the world to have them. For example, in America, we have well over a dozen national security laws, everything from the Patriot Act to the Homeland Security Act. We have many of these laws passed to protect American citizens. I know that support for this law is very divided amongst the Hong Kong citizens. When that law was passed, there was many people in Hong Kong that were certainly celebrating the law being passed. Obviously bringing some peace and stability back to the city. Obviously, there was many people that were not happy with this being passed. So my question for you gentlemen that I'd like to know, is what has the city been like after the passing of this law? And what are your views on the legal ramifications of this law? Do you feel that this law disproportionately limits civil liberties for Hong Kong citizens?
I think it's really changed the situation. So there are not many radicals anymore on the streets, protesting or rioting every day. Instead, I think in general, maybe also due to the coronavirus pandemic, right? It's really calmed down the situation and it's quite stable. In the past, maybe back in May, in June, I'd be quite afraid to go outside. But now I can walk out pretty freely. I don't have to really care about these personal safety issues because of the law. So I think on that front, it's really improved a lot. Now, onto the legal ramifications. So my point of view is that if the law only targets the radicals, all right, which they've done so far, all right, they've only targeted the very minority separatists who really want to go and separate Hong Kong out from China. I think it's fine because, as you said, in America, in the UK, Canada, all these countries have national security laws that prevents such actions. So I don't think it's that uncommon. So I think it's justified. The only problem I will have, which hasn't occurred, and I hope it won't occur in the future, is if it goes and maybe prosecute people who are not necessarily separatist, but only simply maybe pan-democrats who are anti-government and have a distant voice. That will be a step too far for me. But for right now, I don't think that's the case. The law so far has been implemented in a way that only targets a sector of minority individuals. And don't forget is that in the law itself, there are certain safeguards. For example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights actually does apply to Hong Kong, not mainland China, but Hong Kong. And it's also included in the law itself. So I think as long as the judicial system here in Hong Kong upholds these sort of provisions, then it should be fine.
Hong Kong is Asia's world city. I mean, it is an incredible city. And that's where it was, where people were, for instance, if you wore the wrong shirt color outside, you could potentially be attacked. If you spoke Mandarin Chinese in the streets of Hong Kong, you could be attacked, and that's how bad the situation was. So I agree with you. I mean, I think it was an important step for the city to take because you can't have Asia's world city having these violent actions. So that's good to hear. Obviously that's the main target there is to, to really safeguard everybody in Hong Kong.
I think we really have to dig into the legal details and the constitutional ramifications of this bill. So I think in general, we just have to base our opinions on facts and logic, on rationality, right? We shouldn't base our opinions on emotional rhetoric or hatred of other groups simply because they disagree with us. Article 6 of the National Security Law guarantees that interpretation of the law will be performed by the Hong Kong judiciary in line with our common law values. So the idea, I was watching a Ben Shapiro video on the national security law recently. He said, China has just subjected 7 million people to communist tyranny, which to me just sounds ridiculous. I don't know if he genuinely believes it or if it's just, theatrics. In reality, the law clearly stipulates that this law will be interpreted in accordance to our values, in accordance to our legal system. And the idea that people would just be, arrested and sent to the mainland and trialed and just doesn't make any sense. Even if these people were to be trialed in the mainland, they would be trialed in accordance with Hong Kong SAR national security law, not the mainland version of the national security law, which implies that the protections given to them under the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and also our common law values have to be taken into account when they're being trialed in the mainland. That sort of irrational, phobia or hatred of the mainland, or just this, total misunderstanding of the bill, is what drove many people to go and riot and even, throw away their life prospects and, become rioters into us. And
right.
It's truly saddening.
And unfortunately, things, spread so fast on social media. And how many people these days actually, would download a law and read it, from A to Z and actually try to understand it. Now, this is what I love about you guys and what the work that you do. Two of the words that you said, fact and logic. That's why I love your YouTube videos, because you break down all of these laws. You talk about it with fact and logic. Obviously, as law students yourselves, you're saying, wow, this is a new national security law. Let's take a look at that bill. Let's read it. I mean, that's a great insight, that even if they were actually sent back to Beijing, they would still have to be tried under the Hong Kong law. So this rule of law, the freedoms, the rights, they're still going to have to honor that, which no one has said. This is why I'm bringing you on the show, because you guys are law students. You're studying the law. You have the insights into Hong Kong. This is so exciting to, to gain these insights. But we can also see, why so many people, it's very easy to misunderstand this, because again, most people don't read the bills.
The UK has various anti-terrorism legislation.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the Anti-Terrorism Act in the UK, you cannot use force or even employ a threat of force to push a political, religious, or ideological agenda. And
right.
That's actually what the rioters in Hong Kong basically are doing when they wave US flags, wave UK flags, burn NTR stations, and then say 5 demands, not one less. That's basically the use of force and a threat of use of force to push their own political agenda, which are these 5 demands, which includes universal suffrage, which obviously is a political aim. So the idea that the national security law is somehow tyrannical or somehow disproportionate is in fact untrue, because if you can go out to the street and wave an American flag or a UK flag, then you're basically saying, well, I would rather live in these countries. But in reality, reality is, if you had been living in those countries and you were doing the exact same thing, you would in fact be punished and be arrested.
Yeah, I think we did like a video recently about national security law, and we actually also compared national security law in Spain, where you've got like Catalan independence leaders that have been jailed for like 7-8 years, Basque council leaders being jailed as well under like rebellion and sedition crimes.
Right.
So it actually shows that it's pretty common even in Western countries, like in the European Union, all right, where there are also these so-called democratic liberal values, that these acts can also be subject to national security provisions. And I think this really shows that the so-called double standards that the Western world has towards Hong Kong, or in general China, is really to do with the recent anti-China bias they have in total. It's not really specifically about Hong Kong, the judicial system here, but in general, like with the trade war going on, it's all linked together.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, let me segue into our next topic, and that is going to be democracy, and really, the thought of democracy in Hong Kong, amongst the youth. And I'm going to open this up by saying that, in 2014, I personally attended, the protest, which was called the Umbrella Movement. I was down in Central. I spent a lot of time down there because I found it, it was a fascinating time to be in the city of Hong Kong. I spent a lot of time talking to protesters. One of the things that, kind of the biggest takeaway that I, learned was that I feel that many people really didn't understand democracy. And even some of the students had said, you know what, it'd be really cool to vote. I just would like to have a free vote. I think it'd be fun to do. And it was almost this very casual sense that, they didn't really understand what they were protesting for. And so I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about that. Do you feel that many of the youth in Hong Kong feel democracy is this silver bullet? And, do you think that they truly really understand everything about it?
These people are engaging in what could be characterized as recreational rebellion or recreational revolution, which is the idea that you don't really exactly understand what you're fighting for, but then I don't want to say they're bored, but maybe you really want to make a change, and, have a sense of purpose in life, and then you just go out and do stuff in chase of a goal, an abstract idea, in this case would be democracy, but they don't exactly understand what the idea is simply because they have something to chase. And I think it's really important to remember that democracy is not just a sheet of paper. It's just not a ballot sheet. It's not like you take a box and then bang, there you have it. You have a fledgling democracy. Everybody lives happily ever after. I think we have to make a distinction between a procedural democracy and a substantive democracy. So I think what's really important to bear in mind is the core of any civilized society is these values, right? These democratic values, such as a plurality of opinions, civil discourse, mutual respect, and most importantly, the rule of law. And I think the idea that you can simply give people a ballot sheet without instilling in them these sort of democratic values and educating them in these values really doesn't help you. I mean, all you end up with is a banana republic, right? It's basically, the idea that it's kind of like what the behavior that some of these Hong Kong youngsters, not all of them, but some of them, have exhibited in recent years, which is the idea that they simply cannot tolerate alternative opinions. They cannot tolerate people with whom they disagree. And to us, that is very undemocratic. And even if you were to give them a ballot sheet, they would just tear it apart, ignore the results, reject the results like Donald Trump has done if he thinks the results are unfair. So it's kind of like, well, if you had a democracy, would that really actually mean anything? Because I think to us, democracy, the purpose of having democracy is to help us reach a compromise in society, right? It's a good way for us to all express our opinions, all debate each other in a public arena, and then we can reach an overlapping consensus, and then we can move forward as a society, as a collective, right? So we have to work with each other. But if you really observe the behavior of these youngsters, I don't think they actually understand democratic values. So it's kind of like what Thomas Jefferson has said, democracy requires well-reasoned participants. And it's also the reason why Socrates hated democracy, because he thought that most people simply weren't equipped mentally to participate in a functional democracy. And I think right now at this juncture, I'm not saying in the future, maybe we would have better education and then we could actually have a democracy that's workable. But right now at this juncture in time, I simply do not think that it would work because people simply, wouldn't be well-reasoned participants in such a system. It's
funny as an American, because I remember in 2016 when Donald Trump won the election, many people took to the streets and, hashtag he's not my president. And it really bothered me, because I said, well, if you believe in democracy, it is about having everybody has a chance to vote. However, you can't say that I voted, but I don't like the outcome, so he's not my president. It is, we all vote, and then we get behind it. And like you said, everybody needs to say, okay, this is the winner. We all need to come together, realize that that is how this democratic process works. Again, here we are 4 years later. Now he's lost, and we have the same. Now we have the other camp saying, okay, Joe Biden is not my president. Donald Trump actually won this election. And again, these are going very much against the democratic values. So yeah, I mean, I could make the argument. I don't think many Americans are really truly understanding how, the true democratic process here. And I do understand as well, and that's something that I've advocated on several of my videos as well, is that, voting really is a responsibility. I mean, it does take a lot of education and a lot of research to do that. It should not be a popularity contest. I think that's what it is becoming, in an age like social media. But ideally, this is a very complex decision when you're voting for somebody and everybody, ideally you would be educated and you would be researching and taking a lot of time to calculate a very good decision.
Yeah, I think what you've just said, Cyrus, is very similar to what the former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew has said, which is basically you need to have a certain amount of educated people before we can actually have a functional democracy. And I think what ties back into what the Hong Kong youth at the moment has, this misconception, is that even in the West, you can see that there are different types of democracy. And to me, I think many of the Western countries now are experiencing an existential crisis at the moment, where you've got what could be characterized as democratic backsliding, which is the decrease or decline in the quality of democracy. So US, UK, these countries, you can see that, yes, so polarized. Like in my opinion, I'm not saying that they don't deserve democracy, they do, but maybe substantively, they may not be enjoying democracy, even procedurally, there is a democracy. So right. I think only a very few amounts of countries in the world that really do enjoy both at the moment. For example, countries like Switzerland, or like maybe Scandinavia, like Iceland, Norway, all right, they have a very small population, highly educated with critical thinking. So you can see it's really functionable. But otherwise, if you look at other Western systems, it's not really that functionable. And to put that directly into Hong Kong, which by the way, we have our own values, we can't just simply put what the West has put here, because after all, this is Asia, all right? We need to also respect local values as well. To say that it's directly compatible, then we need to really think about whether it is actually true, because without the education, without people actually going to have a think about different sides of the spectrum, it's really difficult to, actually find a good leader for us. Otherwise, it's, as you've said, just like a popularity contest.
I think the correct way to go forward is that we all have to sit down as fellow Hong Kong citizens and then really come up with an economic strategy that helps us make the pie larger. The way forward shouldn't be, oh, we're going to make the rich poorer, even if it entails that poor will also be poorer. I mean, to us, that's not exactly a good way to move forward. But sadly, that's the kind of rhetoric that you see, which is coming out of many, Hong Kong youngsters at the moment.
We are in Asia. You have your own unique laws that need to be there. So I've always been a very big advocate of, for instance, American democracy. It is not something that we can copy and paste and really put anywhere in the world. I mean, you could not bring American democracy across the border to Canada. Canada's system is very different, than America. So the thought of actually bringing it to the Far East and putting it into Hong Kong or anywhere else really would be very difficult, and I think that is something that all local governments really need to understand is, understanding the local issues, the people, and having a unique form of government for them. Maybe a form of democracy, but like you had said earlier, maybe it's democracy, under the Chinese rule, and making sure that that relationship to China, stays in the balance is very important. And actually, that is going to lead us to the final topic, and that is going to be one of the statements that I have made on this on my YouTube channel is that the future of Hong Kong depends on a good relationship with China. Now, one of the things that I really like was in 2016 when Jackie Chan won the Academy Award. He said, "I want to thank Hong Kong, my city, my hometown, who made me, but I want to thank China, my country. I'm proud to be Chinese." And this is the last question I want to ask both of you is, do you feel that this is an accurate portrayal of a healthy relationship between Hong Kong and China? And would you both regard yourselves as Chinese and proud of this relationship between Hong Kong and China?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think being so-called a Hong Konger doesn't necessarily mean you have to be not Chinese. I think it's not really mutually exclusive. Yeah. And for me, I embrace both identities. So obviously, I'm very proud that I'm from Hong Kong. We have our own unique values, which might be a bit different from mainland China. We should keep that, to preserve our own autonomy. But at the same time, don't forget, ethnically, we are Chinese. I'm also proud of that as well. Do I identify myself as Chinese? Yes. Do I identify myself as a Hong Konger? Yes, as well. And for me as well, because my father actually grew up in Wales, in the UK. So I also embrace the sort of Welsh identity because I've got adoptive grandparents in Wales. So I have this sort of mixture of these different identities and values, like Chinese, Welsh, Hong Kong, all mixed together. And I think there's no inherent conflict between the two. I can embrace both Western values and Eastern values. And that's what actually we have said all along, is that we, as Hong Kong people, we're in the unique position where we are as a gateway for the West to enter China and China to enter the West, all right? And we should be the best of both worlds.
I think many people in Hong Kong, especially amongst the younger generation, they kind of refute or reject their Chinese identity because they have a lot of prejudicial misunderstandings regarding the mainland. But in the mainland, I think the younger generation is they're so open-minded, and they're very well educated in Western ideas, in Western history, and so on. And I have many mainland friends whom I met in university in London, and I've always been able to have an open dialogue with them. And one really interesting phenomenon that I've noticed is if you are a mainland person and then you walk into a group of Hong Kongers, they'll be like, oh, he's a mainlander and let's not talk to him. He's probably brainwashed. But
right.
myself being a Hong Kong person, when I walk into a group, I play basketball with mainlanders in London. They all know that I'm from Hong Kong, but they don't really look at me in a bad way or in a negative light. And even if they do want to engage with me upon, questions of, oh, do you feel Chinese, or do you hate mainlanders? Do you hate the central government? They've always asked these questions in a very respectful kind of, open-minded manner. And I've always been able to have an open dialogue with them, on the basis of rationality and civility, based on facts and logic. And it's not like these Hong Kongers who, I don't want to generalize. It's just that some Hong Kongers in London, when they see a mainlander, they'd be like, oh, he's a mainlander, he's bad, he's evil. And I don't think that's really the approach that we should take, especially not in the 21st century. Going to the mainland on our own has really changed our perception of the mainland.
Absolutely.
So I think if you were to communicate and, just go to the mainland, have a look for yourself and start, instead of relying on secondhand information. It's the same thing with, reading legislation, reading the national security law, reading the extradition bill. You really have to understand from a subjective standpoint before you can judge. And I think that applies to most things in the world, not just the mainland, not just, laws, legislation. So I think that's a mentality that Hong Kong youngsters would really benefit from if they were to adopt.
No, I think you guys have hit on some really great points there. One of the things that I want to share is, my wife and I were actually married in Hong Kong. Our daughter was born in Hong Kong, so my wife is Chinese. I'm Caucasian, obviously. We have a mixed race daughter. And because she has Chinese blood, she was able to get Hong Kong citizenship, but she's also gets American citizenship from me. My wife's Canadian. I'm also German. So she has the same thing. And I think this is the beautiful thing about our world is how, cultures are coming together. But like you said, it is on us to approach things with an open mind. And I like how you've said that, that you go to mainland China, you use facts and logic, let's have an open dialogue. Let's go have a look. And, it's surprising to know that there are still many people in Hong Kong that have not spent a lot of time in mainland. So they might have these prejudices. So obviously, if Hong Kong people can have these prejudices or maybe just misunderstandings about the mainland, certainly there's going to be Westerners around the world that would have similar viewpoints and not really understand China. And I think that's really what we're trying to do, certainly on this show, on the YouTube channels, and the work that we're trying to do is trying to help people understand more about each other, but also to really help more cultures come together, and I think that is a big thing we need to do. And the same thing, like you had mentioned, with the political landscape in Hong Kong, there's a tremendous amount of diversity in there. Like we mentioned, it's not simply two camps. We have many different viewpoints, amongst the different camps that are in Hong Kong. But it is important, that we embrace dialogue, we use facts and logic, and that we can have a better understanding of one another.
Now I want to thank the Keybros for coming on the debut episode of Real Talk China. If you're interested in following their work, you can find a link to their YouTube channel in the description below. If you haven't already, I invite you to click that subscribe button and follow us as I continue to bring you more insights through this show, Real Talk China, along with my regularly scheduled content. Now, if you're interested in becoming part of an exclusive community and helping this channel grow faster, I also invite you to come and check out our Patreon account. And finally, my last question that I'll end today's video is this: who would you like to see as the next guest on Real Talk China? Everyone, my name is Cyrus Janssen. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with me here on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. Thank you.